It began with something so small, so ordinary, that I almost didn't notice. In the sprawling suburban maze of townhomes and carefully painted fences, parking was always at a premium. Each resident had their designated spots, marked clearly with bold numbers that corresponded to the unit. It was a system that should have worked flawlessly, a solution designed to prevent arguments, to keep order, and to give everyone the peace of mind that came with knowing their little patch of asphalt was theirs alone. But there's always one person who believes rules were written for everyone else. And in our neighborhood, that person was Karen. The first time I saw her car parked in my assigned spot, I dismissed it as a mistake. Maybe she had friends visiting and didn't notice the numbers. Maybe she was new, unfamiliar with the layout. My spot sat conveniently near the mailboxes, a prime location that saved residents from hauling groceries across the entire lot. I told myself she'd realize soon enough and move. But days went by, and the car didn't move. It was an oversized SUV, polished within an inch of its life, the kind that demanded attention without ever earning it. The vanity plates gleamed in the sun, and the bumper stickers told the story of someone who lived loudly and without apology. Every time I returned home, there it was, squatting in the spot that wasn't hers. At first, I parked elsewhere. I tucked my car into visitor spaces, dragging bags and boxes farther than I should have had to. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself it wasn't worth making enemies. Yet each evening, as I watched her stroll from my parking spot to her front door, balancing shopping bags or tapping on her phone without a glance at anyone around her, a slow burn of resentment started to build. I thought about approaching her directly. But Karen wasn't the type you could reason with. Even without words, her body language screamed entitlement. She parked like she owned the pavement, striding across the lot like the rest of us were merely renting space in her world. I knew what would happen if I confronted her. She'd brush me off, maybe even escalate, turning the whole neighborhood into an audience for her theatrics. Instead, I went to the HOA. That's what they were there for, right? A simple complaint, a reminder letter, and the problem would be solved. I filed the paperwork, snapped photos of her car sitting smugly in my spot, and sent it all off. Days later, the only response I got was silence. The SUV remained, unmoved, unbothered, and very much in my space. The HOA either hadn't acted or didn't care. And Karen? She was thriving. She seemed to take longer and longer strolls to her car, keys jingling with exaggerated flair as if daring me to say something. The thing about small inconveniences is that they pile up. One evening of dragging groceries wasn't much. A week of parking on the far side of the lot wasn't the end of the world, but after nearly a month, the frustration sank into my bones. Every time I carried heavy bags past her SUV, every time I trudged through the rain while her polished tires sat dry and safe in my rightful place, I felt the balance tipping. That was when I noticed something strange. One afternoon, I came home early and parked far enough away to watch unnoticed. Karen wasn't just using my spot randomly. She had claimed it. Her own assigned space, clearly marked just a few rows down, remained empty day after day. She wasn't confused and she wasn't careless. She had decided, with no regard for rules, that my space was better, more convenient, and therefore hers. It was deliberate theft, carried out in broad daylight. And suddenly it wasn't just about parking anymore. It was about principle. It was about boundaries. It was about how one person could so easily disregard everyone else, and how she had grown confident doing it because no one ever stood in her way. That night, lying in bed, I thought about my options. I could keep pestering the HOA, though it was clear they had no interest in helping. I could confront her directly, but I already knew she would twist the narrative, painting herself as the victim of a hostile neighbor. Or I could wait, watch, learn, and then act. Because people like Karen thrived on the belief that no one would challenge them. They strutted and preened, convinced the world would bend rather than push back. But there's something satisfying about waiting for the perfect opportunity, the moment when the trap can be set without them even realizing they've walked right into it. So I bided my time. I started keeping mental notes of when she came and went, how long she stayed, and how she behaved. I noticed she often left her SUV idling while she ran quick errands inside. I noticed she liked to linger by the mailboxes, chatting loudly on her phone. I noticed she believed her own convenience was worth more than anyone else's comfort. Each observation became a piece of the puzzle, and slowly the edges of a plan began to form in my mind. It wasn't enough to simply reclaim my spot. Karen needed to learn a lesson, a reminder that rules existed for a reason, that her arrogance had consequences. And if no one else in the neighborhood had the will to put her in her place, then I would. I didn't know it then, but that decision would set off a chain of events that spiraled far beyond a simple parking dispute. The battle lines had been drawn, even if only I could see them. And soon, Karen would learn what happens when you push the wrong neighbor too far. For now, though, I waited in silence, watching from the shadows of my own home as Karen once again pulled her SUV neatly into my spot, her headlights sweeping arrogantly across my front door. She thought she had won. She thought her dominance was absolute. But she had no idea the game had only just begun. The silence from the HOA stretched longer than I expected. After my first complaint, I gave them the benefit of the doubt. Perhaps paperwork took time. Perhaps warnings had to be mailed, responses drafted, fines processed. I waited a week, then another. But the SUV remained firmly in place, a stubborn landmark of entitlement that taunted me every time I stepped outside. Eventually, a thin envelope appeared in my mailbox, stamped with the HOA's official crest. My pulse quickened as I tore it open, expecting confirmation that action was finally being taken. Instead, the letter was little more than a polite dismissal. They thanked me for bringing the matter to their attention, assured me that parking concerns are taken seriously, and then ended with a vague reminder that residents are encouraged to resolve disputes amicably with their neighbors before involving the board. It was a brush-off, a form letter designed to discourage further complaints. The HOA, it seemed, had no interest in becoming entangled in anything that might require effort. Karen had won this round. The very next day, I spotted her standing in the parking lot with another neighbor, animatedly telling a story. Though I couldn't hear every word, I caught enough to understand. She gestured toward my assigned spot, then to her SUV, and laughed. The other neighbor chuckled nervously, clearly unwilling to challenge her but equally uncomfortable participating in her mockery. Karen thrived in that discomfort. She knew people preferred to avoid conflict, and she weaponized that silence to cement her control. What had once been mild irritation now curdled into something sharper. She wasn't simply stealing a space anymore. She was flaunting her theft, feeding on the unspoken acknowledgement that no one dared confront her. Every step she took from my spot to her door became a performance of dominance, a victory march broadcast to the neighborhood. I began to wonder if she had done this before. How many neighbors had surrendered pieces of their peace simply because they didn't want to deal with her? How many small concessions had been made to keep her from erupting into full-blown tantrums? The more I thought about it, the more I realized Karen's pattern was predictable. She pushed, waited, and when no one pushed back, she claimed new ground as her own. My spot was simply her latest conquest. I had to change the rules. From that moment forward, I refused to park anywhere else. Visitor spaces were off limits. The far side of the lot no longer existed. Instead, I hovered when I came home, circling slowly until I caught Karen's SUV in my spot. Then I'd park directly behind her, boxing her in. The first time I did it, adrenaline shot through my veins. My hands trembled slightly as I shut off the engine and stepped out. I didn't linger. I walked inside casually as though nothing were unusual, though my heart thundered with anticipation of the fallout. Hours later, I heard her pounding on my door. The rhythm was frantic, demanding, but I stayed silent. Let her knock. Let her stew. Eventually she left, stomping back down the stairs, her voice rising in muffled outrage as she called someone on her phone. I imagined her hissing into the receiver, venom spilling in every word. The next morning, her SUV was gone from my spot. For a few days, the strategy worked. Each time she dared park in my space, I trapped her in. Each time she was forced to confront the inconvenience of her own selfishness. It wasn't direct confrontation, but it was undeniable. But Karen wasn't the type to surrender quietly. Instead of backing down, she escalated. One evening, I returned home to find a note taped to my door. The paper was creased, the handwriting jagged with fury. It accused me of harassment, of creating a hostile environment, and ended with a threat to involve the HOA and even the police if I continued interfering with her property. Her property. She had written the words without hesitation, as though claiming ownership of my assigned spot by sheer force of will. I almost laughed, but beneath the humor was something darker. Karen wasn't just stubborn, she was delusional. In her mind, the rules didn't apply. Reality bent to her narrative, and anyone who challenged her became the villain. The note wasn't enough to scare me, but it was enough to remind me I needed a longer-term plan. Boxing her in only worked temporarily. Sooner or later, she'd find a way to twist it against me, to spin the story until I became the problem neighbor. Sure enough, a week later, another envelope arrived from the HOA. This one was less polite. It accused me of obstructing access to another resident's vehicle, citing complaints they had received. It warned that fines would follow if the behavior continued. Karen had beaten me to the punch. She'd gone on the offensive, weaponizing the very board that had ignored my initial complaints. And now she had an official document painting me as the aggressor. The injustice of it all lit a fire inside me. I had followed the rules. I had gone through the proper channels. Yet somehow, I was the one being punished while Karen basked in smug victory. It was clear now. The HOA wasn't going to help. If I wanted my spot back, if I wanted to put an end to Karen's reign of entitlement, I'd have to take matters entirely into my own hands. So I started documenting everything. Photos, timestamps, videos of her pulling into my space while her own remained empty. Every note, every knock, every time she raised her voice in the lot, I logged it meticulously. The evidence became my shield and my weapon. And as the folder grew thicker, so did my determination. Karen thought she had won. She thought the HOA's warning was the final word. But she had no idea I was just getting started. Because if she wanted to play games, I was ready to play them better. And unlike her, I didn't need to scream or stomp or tape furious notes to doors. All I needed was patience, proof, and the perfect plan. The SUV sat smugly in my spot that night, headlights winking at me like a taunt. I stared at it through my blinds, the corners of my mouth curling into a grim smile. Karen thought she had silenced me. She thought she had backed me into a corner, but in truth, she had only given me the clarity I needed. It was no longer just about parking. It was about teaching her, and everyone else watching, that there are limits to entitlement. And when those limits are crossed, there's always someone willing to push back harder. The first steps of my plan were already forming, and soon, Karen would find herself caught in a web she couldn't twist her way out of. By the time the calendar turned over to the next month, I had built an entire archive of Karen's entitlement. My phone was filled with photographs of her SUV sitting proudly in my numbered space, each image stamped with date and time. I had videos too, grainy clips captured from my window, documenting her routine like clockwork. Each morning she left for errands. Each afternoon she returned and slid neatly into the spot marked with my unit number. Her own space, pristine and empty, remained untouched, as though she had abandoned it completely. But evidence alone wasn't enough. I knew Karen could spin any story to her advantage. She had already done so once, convincing the HOA I was the aggressor. If I wanted my revenge to stick, I needed to catch her in a way she couldn't deny or twist. Something public, something undeniable, something that turned her arrogance against her. That was when I decided the key wasn't just in the rules, but in the stage. Karen thrived on performance, on playing the loudest character in every scene. All I had to do was give her the perfect stage and let her reveal herself. It'd start. D with subtle bait. I began parking deliberately in my spot whenever I knew she was due home. The first time she pulled into the lot and saw me already there, her SUV hesitated in the lane, headlights cutting across the asphalt like an angry glare. For a long moment, she idled, waiting for me to move, as though I might yield out of intimidation. When I didn't, she jerked the wheel and sped into her own assigned spot, tires squealing louder than necessary. It was a small victory, but it told me something crucial. She wasn't going to back down quietly. She saw me as an obstacle now, a challenge to her claimed territory. The second layer of bait was patience. On nights when she wasn't home yet, I'd park in a visitor space deliberately close to mine. Then I'd wait, watching from behind my blinds. Inevitably, she'd return and slide into my spot as though nothing had changed. The sight made my blood boil, but I forced myself to stay calm. Because this wasn't the moment. Not yet. I needed her to slip in front of an audience. The opportunity came sooner than expected. Our HOA held monthly meetings in the small community hall by the pool. Hardly anyone attended unless there was gossip to be heard or complaints to be voiced. But Karen never missed a meeting. She thrived in that setting, relishing the sound of her own voice, dominating discussions with complaints about everything from lawn care to trash bins. I marked the next meeting date on my calendar and began preparing. The night of the meeting, I parked deliberately in my assigned spot, even though Karen was already there. Her SUV sat smugly in place, headlights dark, paint gleaming. I positioned my car directly behind it, boxing her in as I had before. Then I locked up and walked calmly to the hall, my phone in hand, every step rehearsed. Karen arrived minutes later, storming through the doors with her usual flair. She shurried the storm with her, voice rising above the room as she declared herself the victim of harassment, obstruction, and bullying. She described my actions in vivid detail, painting herself as a helpless resident tormented by a vindictive neighbor. The board listened, some nodding politely, others checking their watches. A few neighbors exchanged uncomfortable glances, but no one interrupted. Karen had claimed the stage, and she was milking every second. That was when I stood. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. Instead, I unlocked my phone, scrolled to the carefully curated folder, and held it up for the board to see. Photograph after photograph filled the screen. Karen's SUV, parked in my numbered spot, day after day, week after week. Videos played silently, her car sliding into place, her strutting away without a glance, her space sitting empty in the background. The dates and times were stamped clearly on each image. The room shifted. The murmurs began. Heads turned, whispers rippled, and the weight of evidence pressed down on every corner of the hall. Karen's voice faltered. For the first time, she hesitated. She sputtered excuses, temporary mix-ups, emergencies, visitor overflow, but each lie crumbled against the sheer consistency of the record. There was no emergency that repeated daily for over a month. There was no overflow when her own spot sat empty in every frame. Her performance cracked. And when it cracked, the audience saw her for what she truly was. The HOA board, faced with undeniable proof, had no choice but to act. They issued warnings, threatened fines, and promised towing for repeat offenses. Karen protested, raising her voice, insisting the photos were staged, manipulated, taken out of context. But the more she spoke, the thinner her words became. The meeting ended in a swirl of tension, and Karen stormed out, face flushed, eyes blazing. I followed at a distance, calm, collected, phone still in my hand like a weapon she couldn't disarray. Outside, I watched as she marched to the lot, only to find her SUV still trapped neatly behind mine. Her hands clenched at her sides, shoulders rising and falling with rapid breaths. She knew she couldn't lash out here, not after what had just unfolded inside. Too many eyes were watching now. For once, Karen was silent. I walked past her casually, slid into my car, and backed out slowly, deliberately, giving her just enough room to pull away. She didn't thank me. She didn't speak. She simply yanked her door open and drove off with tires screeching like a wounded animal. That night, for the first time in weeks, my spot sat empty, waiting for me. It was a victory, but I knew better than to believe it was over. Karen wasn't the type to surrender gracefully. She had been humiliated, stripped of her imagined authority in front of the entire neighborhood, and people like Karen didn't forgive, and they certainly didn't forget. No, this was just the beginning. Because if there's one thing worse than an entitled neighbor, it's an entitled neighbor who feels cornered. And Karen, humiliated and exposed, was about to become more dangerous than ever. For a few days after the HOA meeting, the parking lot felt almost peaceful. My spot sat empty whenever I left or returned, waiting like it always should have. Karen's SUV, stripped of its stolen throne, began appearing in her own designated space again. On the surface, it looked like I had won. The evidence had spoken, the board had ruled, and order had been restored. But anyone who has dealt with a Karen knows peace is never permanent. The silence wasn't surrender. It was the storm pulling back, gathering strength before crashing forward with greater force. The first sign came in the form of pettiness. Small, almost laughable things at first. A trail of fast food wrappers scattered on the edge of my driveway one morning. A smear of something sticky across the handle of my mailbox. My garbage cans, inexplicably tipped over twice in 1 week. Minor annoyances, easily dismissed as shrill, cutting through the hum of conversation. She shouted accusations, waving her arms dramatically, pointing at my car as though it were a crime scene. Neighbors turned to look, some whispering, others shaking their heads. Karen didn't care. She was in her element, performing for anyone who would listen, spinning tales of harassment, stalking, bullying. What she didn't know was that every second of her tirade was being recorded. The dash camera captured it all. The gesturing, the shouting, the baseless accusations hurled into the open air. She was exposing herself, live, in front of the very community whose sympathy she craved. And just when I thought it couldn't get better, she made her fatal mistake. In a fit of anger, Karen slapped her hand against my hood. The sound cracked through the lot, followed by the screech of her nails dragging across the paint. Gasps rippled from the neighbors watching. Children froze mid-game. Parents whispered urgently, pulling them back. Karen had crossed the line. And this time, the evidence wasn't just mine. It was the community's. I stepped outside then, calm and measured, phone in hand. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The sight of me recording, combined with the witnesses surrounding us, was enough. Karen's face paled, her voice faltered, and for the first time she looked around and realized the audience wasn't on her side. She fled, storming back to her SUV and slamming the door so hard it rattled. Tires screeched as she sped away, leaving behind a silence heavy with tension. But the silence didn't last. Neighbors began murmuring, some approaching me quietly, shaking their heads, offering words of support. The tide had turned. Karen wasn't just my problem anymore. She had become the neighborhood's spectacle, the villain in her own play. That night, as I transferred the dash camera footage to my growing archive, I knew the ball. Ants of power had shifted again. Karen had wanted to retaliate, to humiliate me, to reclaim the control she thought she'd lost. But in her desperation, she had given me everything I needed. The evidence was overwhelming now, and with the neighborhood watching, she couldn't twist her way out. The stage was set for the final act. The footage from my dash camera became the crown jewel of my collection. It wasn't just proof of Karen's entitlement. It was irrefutable evidence of harassment, vandalism, and public disturbance. The camera had caught her shouting in the lot, clawing her nails across my hood, and humiliating herself in front of dozens of witnesses. For the first time since this ordeal began, I felt the tide fully turn. No longer was it just my word against hers. Now, I had the truth on record, with neighbors who had seen it all unfold. The following Monday, I sent everything to the HOA in one neatly organized file. Photos, timestamps, videos, written logs. It was a dossier thicker than anything they had likely ever received. I didn't send it quietly, either. I copied every board member, the property manager, and even a few neighbors who had been present during Karen's meltdown. There would be no way for them to brush this aside. The response was swift. Within days, Karen received an official notice of violation from the board. The letter, distributed not just to her but also to the entire community, outlined her offenses in sterile, professional language. Unauthorized use of another resident's parking space, repeated harassment, property damage, disruptive behavior in common areas, and, most importantly, the consequences: steep fines, towing at her expense, and suspension of her HOA privileges until further notice. It was the kind of public reprimand Karen couldn't spin. Her name, attached to violations, broadcast to the very neighbors whose sympathy she once tried to win. The whispers began almost immediately. I could hear them when I walked past groups at the mailboxes or while children played in the lot. Karen wasn't feared anymore. She was mocked. But humiliation alone wasn't enough for me. I still had the scratches on my car, fresh scars etched into the paint as daily reminders of her spite. So I took the next step and filed a police report. Armed with my footage, photos, and logs, I presented everything to the officer at the station. He flipped through the file with raised brows, clearly impressed by the level of documentation. By the end of our meeting, I had a case number and assurance that an investigation would follow. When the officer asked if I wanted to press charges, I didn't hesitate. For once, I wasn't the one on defense. Meanwhile, Karen was unraveling. She stormed through the neighborhood with less of her usual swagger, her shoulders tense, her eyes darting to see who might be watching. Her SUV still gleamed, but now it sat in her assigned spot every night, as though tethered by invisible chains. Gone was the boldness of parking in mine, the arrogance of strolling past my door. She had been forced back into her corner. But cornered animals don't go quietly. The retaliation continued, though more desperate now. One morning, I found a flyer tucked under my windshield wipers, printed in bold, capitalized letters: "Beware of your neighbor. He records you without consent." Below it was a poorly written rant about how I was invading privacy and creating a dangerous environment for children. The flyer was riddled with spelling mistakes and half-truths, clearly Karen's handiwork. The problem for her was that no one believed it. Neighbors who once avoided me now nodded politely in passing. A few even offered quiet encouragement, thanking me for standing up to her. The flyers disappeared as quickly as they appeared, plucked off cars and tossed in the trash by residents who were tired of her games. The more Karen flailed, the more isolated she became. Her voice, once booming across the parking lot, now carried a note of desperation. The audience she had relied on had turned its back, and all she had left was her own echo. Then came the final blow. At the next HOA meeting, the board announced new enforcement measures for community conduct. Security cameras would be installed at key locations, including the parking lot. Towing policies would be tightened. Harassment complaints would now bypass the board entirely and go straight to a property manager with authority to escalate to law enforcement. Everyone knew why the changes were being made. They didn't mention Karen by name, but the glances, the whispers, the sideways smirks made it clear. She had become the example, the reason new rules were needed. Karen sat stiffly in the back of the room that night, lips pressed in a tight line, eyes fixed on the table in front of her. She didn't speak, didn't complain, didn't try to dominate the conversation. For the first time, she looked small. But I knew her silence wasn't peace. It was plotting. Later that week, she made one final attempt to flip the script. A letter appeared on my door, longer than the others, written in her familiar, jagged scrawl. This time she didn't accuse or threaten. Instead, she pleaded. She painted herself as misunderstood, claimed her actions had been blown out of proportion, insisted she had never meant harm. She begged me to let this go, to stop ruining her reputation. It was almost laughable. Karen, who had strutted so boldly, who had screamed and mocked and vandalized, now reduced to scribbled pleas. But beneath the pitiful tone was a thread of malice. She wasn't apologizing, she was attempting to manipulate, to guilt me into erasing the consequences of her own choices. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The system was already in motion, and no letter could undo it. Weeks later, I learned through the neighborhood grapevine that Karen had been fined heavily, not just for the parking violations, but for damages to my car as well. When she refused to pay, the HOA escalated, attaching the fines to her account and threatening legal action. Combined with the police report, it was more than she could handle. The SUV, once her symbol of dominance, sat unused for days at a time. Rumors swirled that she was considering moving, that the pressure and humiliation had become unbearable. Standing at my window, looking down at my spot, empty and waiting for me, I realized something important. I had gotten what I wanted. My space was mine again. Karen had been exposed, humiliated, and cornered by the very system she thought she could bend to her will. The plan had worked. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't quite over. Karen wasn't the type to admit defeat, even when every card was stacked against her. If she was truly moving, I knew she wouldn't go quietly. No, she'd leave one last scar on the neighborhood, one final performance to prove she still mattered. And when she did, I planned to be ready. The neighborhood had grown quieter in the weeks after Karen's public unraveling. Her SUV sat faithfully in her assigned spot, as though chained there by invisible hands. The flyers had stopped, the late-night knocks on my door had ceased, and the trail of petty sabotage had finally dried up. On the surface, it almost seemed like peace had returned. But I knew better. Karen wasn't the type to fade away quietly. Every glimpse I caught of her, storming from her front door with pursed lips, glaring across the lot with narrowed eyes, or stomping back inside after hurried conversations on her phone, confirmed what I already suspected. She was waiting, planning. And then, one evening, she snapped. It was a Saturday, warm and still, the kind of evening where neighbors lingered outside chatting while children chalked the sidewalks. I had just parked in my rightful space, locking my car and heading inside, when the sound of screeching tires cut across the calm. Karen's SUV roared into the lot, swerving dangerously close to parked cars before slamming into her space. The engine idled, growling, before she yanked the keys out and flung the door open. Her voice followed seconds later, sharp, high, desperate. She shouted about injustice, about harassment, about how she was the real victim. But this time, her audience wasn't silent. Neighbors exchanged looks, some openly rolling their eyes, others shaking their heads. A few simply gathered their children and went inside, unwilling to indulge her theatrics anymore. Karen marched straight across the lot, heading toward my door. Her fists were clenched, her face flushed, and every step radiated fury. But before she could knock, before she could unleash whatever final performance she had rehearsed, a police cruiser pulled into the lot. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. 2 officers stepped out, calm and professional, their presence immediately cooling the air. They approached Karen first, speaking in low tones, hands resting lightly on their belts. I couldn't hear every word, but I caught enough. They had received complaints, multiple complaints, about reckless driving, about harassment, about disturbances that evening and in weeks past. And thanks to my police report, my evidence, and the steady pile of documentation that had built up against her, they weren't here to listen to Karen's excuses. They were here for her. Karen's performance crumbled in real time. She tried shouting at the officers, waving her arms, pointing at my window. She tried painting herself as the victim, the innocent neighbor tormented by lies. But the officers didn't flinch. They didn't indulge her. They asked for her ID, took notes, and reminded her of the complaints and violations already on record. When Karen realized her usual tactics weren't working, she shifted to pleading. Her voice dropped, her words softened, but the officers remained unmoved. One of them gestured to her SUV, the scratches still visible on my hood nearby, the dash camera quietly blinking from my windshield. It was all there, the proof, the history, the pattern. Eventually, they handed her a citation. I couldn't see the exact wording, but the weight of it was written all over her face. Her shoulders slumped, her eyes glassy with disbelief. For once, she wasn't the star of her own story. She was the cautionary tale. The officers left without fanfare, and Karen slunk back to her door, avoiding the stares of neighbors watching from porches and windows. The lot fell silent again, but the silence was different this time. It wasn't tense. It wasn't expectant. It was final. In the days that followed, the rumors spread quickly. Some said the fines had finally broken her. Others whispered that the HOA was preparing legal action. And then, one morning, the truth revealed itself in the simplest way possible. The SUV was gone. For the first time in months, her assigned spot sat empty. Hours passed, then a day, then a week. The blinds in her windows stayed drawn, her porch gathered dust, and the once loud presence that had dominated the neighborhood seemed to evaporate into thin air. Karen had left. Whether she moved out quietly in the night or simply retreated to lick her wounds elsewhere, no one knew for certain. But her absence spoke louder than any of her tantrums ever had. The neighborhood relaxed. Conversations bloomed again near the mailboxes. Children played freely in the lot without parents glancing nervously toward her unit. The air felt lighter, as though her departure had lifted a weight from everyone's shoulders. And my spot, my simple, numbered patch of asphalt, was mine again. I parked there every day with a quiet satisfaction, no longer needing to circle the lot or strategize around someone else's arrogance. Each time I slid into PP lace, I felt a small thrill of victory. Not because I had reclaimed what was mine, but because I had proven a point. Entitlement had limits. Arrogance had consequences. And sometimes the best revenge wasn't loud or dramatic. It was patience, proof, and letting the truth speak louder than any tantrum ever could. The neighbors never forgot. Even months later, when conversations drifted to past dramas, someone inevitably brought her up. "Remember Karen?" they'd say, shaking their heads with a chuckle. "The one who thought she owned every parking space?" Laughter followed, always at her expense, never mine. And that was the sweetest victory of all. Not the fines, not the police citation, not even the empty SUV spot. It was the fact that Karen had become a story, a warning, a punchline. Her legacy was no longer control or fear. It was humiliation. As for me, I lived in peace again. The war was over, the battlefield cleared, the lines erased. But every evening, as I pulled into my spot and turned off the engine, I couldn't help but smile. Because in the end, I hadn't just reclaimed my parking space. I had gotten the last laugh,